The morning Rebecca Prescott buried her father, her husband packed his bags and left, and the bank sent a man on horseback to tell her she had 30 days to vacate the only home she had ever known. That was a Monday. By Friday, Cornelius Morgan had ridden into Harrow Creek on a smoke-gray mare with a cracked saddle, $3 to his name, and absolutely no intention of falling in love with anyone. The town of Harrow Creek, Texas, sat in the raw, sun-hammered plain about 60 miles southwest of San Antonio, and in the year of our Lord 1882, it was the kind of place that either made a person or broke them clean in half. The main street was nothing more than a stretch of packed red dirt flanked by a general store, a livery stable, a saloon called the Ironwood, a small church that leaned slightly to the left as though it were listening for something, and a handful of wooden buildings that had been bleached pale by a decade of unrelenting sun. Beyond the town, the land stretched out in every direction like something God had smoothed flat with the back of his hand and then forgot to come back to. Rebecca Prescott was 27 years old, and she had spent those years learning the rhythms of the Prescott homestead the way other women learned hymns by heart, by repetition, by the kind of devotion that does not ask for credit. Her father, Edmund Prescott, had built the property from raw land and stubbornness, and when he died of a fever that started as a cough on a cold October morning, he left Rebecca not a fortune but a set of debts she had not known existed. Her mother had passed when Rebecca was 12. She had no brothers, no sisters, and no husband worth the name. That last part required some explanation. Her husband of 4 years, a man named Dale Whitmore, had come from the eastern part of the state with good clothes and smooth words, and an ability to look a person in the eye that Rebecca had once mistaken for honesty. He had married her when she was 23, moved into the Prescott home, and spent 4 years contributing very little to the land while growing very attached to the money that her father set aside for grain and cattle. By the time Edmund Prescott took ill, Dale had already borrowed against the property without telling anyone, and when the bank called the note due, Dale Whitmore sat his wife down at the breakfast table on the morning of her father's burial, told her he was not made for this kind of life, placed his wedding ring beside the salt shaker, and walked out the door. Rebecca did not cry in front of him. She waited until she heard his horse leave the property, and then she sat down on the kitchen floor with her back against the cabinet and let herself fall apart for exactly 20 minutes. Then she stood up, washed her face, put on her black dress, and went to bury her father. She was not a fragile woman. She was the kind of woman who had learned to be strong not because strength came easily, but because there had never been anyone around to be strong for her. She had dark brown hair that she kept pinned at the back of her neck, and eyes the color of the San Antonio River in summer, a warm, shifting green-brown that seemed to change depending on the light and her mood. She was not tall, but she carried herself as though she were, and the people of Harrow Creek, who had known her since girlhood, respected her in the quiet way that people respect someone they have watched endure things that would have leveled anyone else. It was her neighbor, a wide-shouldered woman named Clara Dutton, who ran the general store with her aging husband Frank, who first told Rebecca about Cornelius Morgan. "There is a man at the livery asking if anyone needs a hand," Clara said. She had brought over a pied dried apple, because it was the only thing she could think to do in the face of all that loss. Drifter, from the look of him, but Hank says he works hard, helped unload the feed delivery without being asked. Rebecca sat across the kitchen table from Clara and stared at the pie. "I cannot afford to hire anyone. He is not asking for much. Hank said the man offered to work for meals and a place to sleep in the barn. Said he does not need wages right away, just enough to get back on his feet." Rebecca was quiet for a moment. The house around her felt enormous in a way it never had before, every room full of someone who was no longer in it. The 30 days the bank had given her were not much time, but they were enough to at least salvage some of the livestock and perhaps negotiate with the bank's man, a soft-handed fellow named Mr. Aldridge, who had looked genuinely uncomfortable delivering the news. She had cattle that needed tending, a fence line that had been neglected for months because Dale had never gotten around to fixing it, and a well that needed its rope replaced before it frayed all the way through. "Send him over," she said finally, "but I will talk to him first." Cornelius Morgan arrived at the Prescott homestead late that same afternoon, just as the sun was beginning its long slide toward the horizon, and the sky over the flat Texas land was turning the color of a peach that has sat too long in the heat. He came on foot, having left his mare at the livery because Hank had offered her a stall and some grain out of what seemed to be a general goodwill toward traveling animals, and he walked up the path to the Prescott house with his hat in his hands, which Rebecca noticed immediately. She was standing on the porch when he came up the path, and she watched him the way she watched everything carefully, without giving anything away in her expression. He was tall, maybe 6 feet or just under, with the kind of lean, rope-muscled build that comes from a life of physical work rather than ambition. He had dark hair that needed cutting, and a jaw that was carrying about 4 days of stubble. His clothes were worn but clean, which told her something. His boots were well-made and resolute, which told her something else. He was somewhere in his early 30s. She would learn later that he was 32, and he had the kind of face that had been weathered by sun and trouble in equal measure, though his eyes, when he finally looked up at her, were a steady, quiet gray that surprised her with their stillness. "Ma'am," he said, "I am Cornelius Morgan. I heard you might need some help around the property." "I heard the same thing about you," she said. "Who are you, Mr. Morgan? Where are you from and where are you going?" He seemed to appreciate that she did not bother with pleasantries. "I am from Missouri originally. I have been working cattle drives out of Abilene for the past several years, but the last drive finished early and my plans after that fell through." He paused. "I am not running from anything, if that is what you are asking. I can provide a reference from trail boss Elias Crane, who runs out of Abilene, if you need one." "What fell through?" she asked. "I was going to buy into a small ranch operation near Laredo with a man I had worked with for 3 years. He decided to go back east to his family instead. It was his money that was going to make the difference." He said it plainly, without self-pity. "I'm not trying to go back east." Rebecca looked at him for a long moment. Behind her, the house was quiet in a way that pressed against her back like a hand. "I have no wages to offer you right now, Mr. Morgan. I have 30 days before the bank takes this property, and I intend to spend those 30 days fighting that outcome with everything I have. In the meantime, I have cattle to tend, fences to fix, and a property that has been neglected. I can offer meals and the use of the barn." "That is fine with me," he said. "If I manage to save this property," she continued, "we can discuss proper wages then. If I do not, you will have wasted 30 days of your time. With respect, ma'am, the alternative is spending 30 days going nowhere in particular. I would rather be of use." She studied him for one more moment. Then she stepped back and gestured toward the barn. "I will show you where things are." His name, she thought, was a remarkable thing for a man to carry through the West. Cornelius. It was the kind of name that belonged to a judge or a senator, not a trail-worn cowhand with a cracked saddle and $3 to his name. She would learn, over the following days, that it had belonged to his grandfather, a man who had emigrated from Ireland with nothing but the name and a fierce conviction that America owed him a chance. Cornelius Morgan had grown up with that story and that name, and he had long since stopped being embarrassed by either. The first week, they worked beside each other with the careful, deliberate distance of two people who are aware of each other in a way they have not yet decided how to address. He rose before dawn and had the horses fed before she came out to start breakfast, and when she called him in to eat, he came without being called twice and ate without complaint and said things like, "Thank you, ma'am," with an earnestness that she found, to her own irritation, somewhat disarming. He fixed the fence line on the second day, working from first light until past midday, and when he came back to wash up at the pump, he had his sleeves rolled to the elbow and his hat pushed back, and there was a cut on the side of his hand from the wire, and she brought him a strip of clean cloth and some carbolic solution without making a fuss about it. "You do not have to do that," he said. "I am not doing it because I feel I have to," she said, wrapping the cloth around his palm with efficient, practiced movements. "I am doing it because a wound that is not tended becomes a problem, and I have enough problems." He looked down at her hands working over his. "That is a very practical reason to be kind. I am a practical person." "I noticed," he said, and there was something in the way he said it, not teasing, not condescending, but something quieter than either of those things, something that sounded almost like admiration, that made her look up at him for a half-second before she finished tying off the cloth and stepped back. She had written to Elias Crane in Abilene on the third day, and the reply that came back 10 days later, via the postal rider, confirmed what Cornelius had said. Crane wrote in a blocky, efficient hand that Cornelius Morgan was the best roper he had worked with in 15 years of driving cattle, that he was honest to a fault, that he did not drink to excess, and that whatever he told you was what was true. At the bottom, in what seemed like an afterthought, Crane had added, "He is the kind of man that a hard country does not deserve." Rebecca folded the letter and put it in her apron pocket and did not mention it to Cornelius. But something in her, something that had been coiled tight since the morning of her father's burial, loosened by the smallest degree. Meanwhile, she was fighting for the house. She had ridden into town on the fourth day and sat across a desk from Mr. Aldridge at the small office the bank kept in Harrow Creek, and she had laid out her case with the precision of someone who has spent 3 sleepless nights organizing her arguments into something that could not be easily dismissed. The debt that Dale Whitmore had borrowed against the property was $340. The cattle she had remaining, 11 head, could sell for perhaps $40 apiece at market prices. She also had the grain stores that could be sold, and her father's mule, and a pair of horses that were worth together maybe $60. "That is the math," she told Mr. Aldridge, who was a round-faced man in his 40s who smelled of bay rum, and looked at her with the uncomfortable expression of someone who knows they are in the presence of a situation that is technically legal but morally untidy. "I can sell those assets and bring you $200 by the end of the week. For the remaining 140 I need 60 more days. Mrs. Whitmore, Miss Prescott," she said, "my husband has gone, please use my name." Aldridge cleared his throat. "Miss Prescott, the bank's policy is—" "I am not asking about the bank's policy," she said. "I am asking whether you, as the bank's representative in this district, have the authority to grant a 60-day extension on the remaining balance." He did. She knew he did, because her father had dealt with this same bank for 20 years, and she had once overheard a conversation between Edmund Prescott and the bank's owner, a man in San Antonio named Hargrove, in which Aldridge's authority to negotiate local debts was clearly established. She watched Aldridge's face work through several calculations, and then he said slowly, "I can grant you 60 additional days on the remainder. But the 200 must be here by Friday." "It will be," she said. When she rode back to the homestead, the sun was going down and she could see Cornelius in the far pasture, moving the cattle to the better grazing ground near the creek, and the sight of him working her land with that quiet, purposeful competence did something strange to her chest that she filed away under things to examine later when she had time. She got the $200. Clara Dutton bought 4 of the cattle herself, paying $40 each with a generosity that Rebecca recognized and felt in a place that was beyond words. 2 more heads sold to a rancher named Beckett who lived 12 miles north. The grain and the horses and the mule accounted for the rest, and she delivered a thick envelope to Aldridge on Thursday, a day early, and shook his hand with a firmness that made him blink. She came home to find that Cornelius had repaired the well rope, cleared the debris from the south side of the barn, where a windstorm last spring had piled brush against the wall, and had a pot of beans and salt pork simmering on the stove, which was something he had never done before. She stopped in the kitchen doorway and looked at the pot and then at him, "I found the salt pork in the cellar," he said, "and I thought you might be tired." She was tired. She was exhausted in every part of her body and most parts of her soul. She sat down at the kitchen table without taking off her coat, and he placed a bowl in front of her without making anything of it, and she ate, and it was one of the kindest things anyone had done for her in longer than she could account for. "I got the extension," she told him. "I figured you would." She looked up. "You sound certain of that." "I am," he said simply. He sat down across from her with his own bowl. "You do not go into a room without knowing how to come out of it." She was quiet for a moment. "My father used to say something like that. He sounds like he was a smart man." "He was," she said. The word was used in the past tense, and it cost her something. And he saw it cost her something. And he did not look away or try to smooth over it, which she appreciated more than she could say. The days that followed settled into a rhythm that began to feel, cautiously, like something livable. Rebecca had kept 4 of the cattle back from the sale, figuring that building the herd back up slowly was better than starting from nothing. And Cornelius worked with those animals with the easy familiarity of someone who has spent years reading the moods of cattle and responding accordingly. He was teaching her things too. She noticed, not by telling her what she did not know, but by doing things in front of her in a way that made the doing itself instructive. She began talking to him in the evenings, not about the big things, not at first, but about the land and the cattle and the small negotiations of running a property. He listened the way some people read, with full attention, not waiting for his turn. And he talked too, when she asked him things, about the drives and the men he had worked with, and the country he had moved through over a decade of following work across Texas and Kansas and into the territories. One evening, about 3 weeks into his stay, they were sitting on the porch steps in the particular blue dark that settled over the land after sunset, and the coyotes were calling somewhere out past the creek, and she asked him why he had never settled somewhere. He was quiet for a moment, turning his hat over in his hands the way he did when he was thinking. "I did not have a reason to," he said at last. "There was always the next drive, the next stretch of country. It is easy to keep moving when you have not found a thing worth stopping for." "And now?" she asked, and she was not entirely sure why she asked it. He looked at the dark land for a moment. "I think I might be finding one," he said quietly, without looking at her. She did not respond right away, and he did not push, and they sat in the quiet together while the coyotes answered each other across the flat dark, and it was the kind of moment that does not need explaining. She thought about Dale Whitmore and what trust had cost her the first time. She thought about the ring beside the salt shaker and the sound of his horse leaving, and she felt the familiar tightening in her chest that she had come to associate with that particular wound. She was not a person who had the luxury of making the same mistake twice. But Cornelius Morgan was not Dale Whitmore, and she was beginning to understand that with a clarity that frightened her a little, the way clarity sometimes does when it arrives in a form you did not expect. The trouble that came into Harrow Creek in early November arrived in the form of a man named Hatch Sorrells, which was not a surprising form for trouble to take if you had spent any time in that part of Texas. Sorrells was a land speculator of the worst variety, the kind who had enough money to make lawyers nervous and enough ambition to make neighbors desperate. He had been buying up properties in the county all year, some of them willingly sold by families who had given up, others acquired through various forms of pressure that were just legal enough to avoid prosecution and just ruthless enough to be effective. The Prescott property was exactly the kind of thing he wanted. It sat on good water. The creek that ran through the south pasture was one of the more reliable water sources in a 10-mile radius. And the land itself, while not dramatic, was solid and well situated. Rebecca learned that Sorrells had been watching the property since her father's death, and that he had, in fact, been the one to remind the bank's owner in San Antonio about the outstanding note on the property. The reminder had prompted Aldridge's visit. This information came to her from Clara Dutton, who had heard it from Frank, who had heard it from the blacksmith Reuben Ochoa, who had no reason to lie and every reason to warn her. When Rebecca heard it, she was standing in the general store on a bright November morning, and her hands went very still against the counter while her mind sorted through the implications with the same efficiency she had applied to the bank negotiation. "He cannot take it from me now," she said. "I have met the bank's terms." "He knows that," Clara said, "but Frank says he is looking at it from another angle. He has been talking to people about water rights, about whether the creek that runs through your south pasture is legally part of your title or whether it could be argued as a separate matter." This was, Rebecca recognized, the kind of legal maneuvering that required money to fight and patience to endure. She did not have a lawyer. She barely had $60. She rode home with a cloud over her that had nothing to do with the weather, which was bright and cold and entirely indifferent to human troubles. And when she came over the rise that looked down on the homestead, she saw Cornelius in the paddock working with the young horse she had decided to keep back from the sale, moving him through a slow circle with a gentle, persistent patience, and something about the image. The man and the horse and the cold sunlight and the smoke rising from the chimney of the house that was still hers, made her eyes burn in a way she refused to let become tears. She told him about sorrels at dinner. Cornelius listened without interrupting, and when she finished he was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "Do you have your land title paperwork?" "In my father's strongbox, yes." "And the deed records from when he originally filed the property?" "Yes." "Then I would like to look at them if you will let me. I have dealt with this kind of dispute before, not as a lawyer, but I know a man who is one. He is in San Antonio. His name is Thomas Garland. He does not charge much to look at something and tell you if there is a problem." She looked at him across the table. "You know a lawyer in San Antonio? I pulled his brother off a bad horse on a drive 3 years ago. He offered to return the favor in whatever way was useful." Cornelius met her eyes steadily. "It might be nothing. The water rights claim might not hold, but I would rather know what we are dealing with." She noticed he had said we. She did not point it out, but she thought about it later in the dark of her room, staring at the ceiling while the November wind moved around the eaves of the house, and she thought that the word had felt entirely natural in his mouth and entirely unexpected in her heart. She let him look at the paperwork. He spent 2 evenings going through it at the kitchen table with the lamp turned up high, his brow furrowed in concentration, occasionally making notes on a piece of paper in the careful, deliberate handwriting of a man who had taught himself to read and write from someone else's cast-off books and taken the education seriously. He found it on the 2nd evening. "Rebecca," he said, and it was the first time he had used her given name without the formality of ma'am or miss in front of it, and she looked up from the mending she had been doing across the table, and the use of her name in his voice landed somewhere in her chest with a warmth she could not dismiss as anything other than what it was. "Look here," he said, turning the old deed document toward her and pointing to a notation in the corner. "Your father filed this property in 1861. The notation here refers to the creek as a running boundary marker, which in Texas land law means the creek is part of the property description itself, not a separate water right. It is incorporated into the title. Sorrels cannot argue it as a separate matter without first challenging the entire deed, and a deed that has stood for 20 years is not easily challenged." She leaned over the table to look at the document, and she was close enough to him that she could smell the soap from when he had washed up after the day's work, and the warmth of the lamp, and she read the notation carefully and then read it again. "You are right," she said. "That is exactly what that means." "Write to Thomas Garland anyway," he said. "Have him look at it. 2 sets of eyes are better than one, and his are trained for this." She wrote the letter that night. Garland's reply came back within a week, confirming everything Cornelius had said, and adding a further point that effectively neutralized any legal argument Sorrels might have attempted. Garland also noted, in a postscript, that he had heard of Hatch sorrels and that the man's acquisition methods had been the subject of quiet complaint among several county landowners, and that if Rebecca ever needed formal representation, he would provide it at a reduced fee in light of his existing debt to a mutual acquaintance. She read the postscript and looked up from the letter at Cornelius, who was outside through the kitchen window, repairing the gate to the paddock in the cold November air, and she felt something rise in her chest that was bigger than gratitude and warmer than relief, and she made herself put the letter down and breathe for a moment before she went to the door. "It is exactly as you said," she called to him. "And then some. Sorrels has no case." He looked up from the gate, and the smile that crossed his face in that moment was not the polite, careful expression she had been seeing for weeks. It was something fuller and less guarded, something that started in his gray eyes and spread slow and genuine across the rest of his face, and it hit her like a change in weather, sudden and all-encompassing. "Good," he said. "That is good." She had written to Sorrels herself, 2 days later, enclosing a copy of the relevant notation and a brief, precise letter that informed him she was aware of his inquiry into her water rights, and that she had consulted legal counsel who confirmed the matter was entirely settled within her existing title. She had also mentioned Thomas Garland's name, which she suspected would have its own effect. Clara Dutton had told her that lawyers made Sorrels nervous, because in her experience men who operated in the gray spaces of legality were always more afraid of the law than the people they were trying to intimidate. There was no reply from Sorrels, and a week later, she heard from Reuben Ochoa that Sorrels had turned his attention to a property 20 miles north, which was unfortunate for whoever owned that property, but a considerable relief to Rebecca Prescott. The afternoon she heard that news, she found Cornelius at the barn and she told him. And then, before she had quite decided to do it, she stepped forward and put her arms around him in the way you embrace someone when the relief is too large to contain at a proper distance. He was still for half a second, she could feel it in his shoulders, and then his arms came around her, careful and warm and entirely solid, and she let herself stand there in the embrace for the length of several heartbeats, and he did not say anything, and she did not say anything. And when she stepped back his expression was something she could not immediately name but that she recognized from somewhere deep. "Thank you," she said, "for all of it, Cornelius." He looked at her for a moment with those steady gray eyes. "You did the fighting," he said. "I just helped you find the ground to fight on." That was the moment, she would say later. That was the exact moment when she understood what was happening to her and she stopped pretending otherwise. She did not act on it immediately. She was Rebecca Prescott, and she had been cautious with her heart for much better reasons than simple shyness, and she needed to be sure of what she was seeing in him before she let herself be sure of what she was feeling in herself. But the care she had been directing at the property, at the legal battle, at the immediate crises of her situation, began to extend itself toward him in ways she could no longer convincingly pretend were simply practical. She learned things about him. She learned that he had grown up poor in Missouri with a father who worked himself into the ground on other men's land, and a mother who died when Cornelius was 14, and that he had gone west at 17 because staying felt like accepting the terms of a life he did not choose. She learned that he could not pass an injured animal without stopping to see to it, which explained why his saddle mare, whose name was June, was so inexplicably devoted to him. She learned that he had taught himself from books on the cattle drive's history, mostly, and some mathematics, and whatever novels the other men had brought along, which he read carefully and quietly and then thought about for days. She learned that he was funny, in a dry, understated way that came out at unexpected moments, and made her laugh before she had prepared herself not to. She also learned that he was watching her the way she was watching him, with that same careful, deliberate attention, and that he was no less cautious than she was, which, given what she knew of his history, made a certain kind of sense. The conversation happened on a December evening when the air outside had gone sharp and cold, and the first frost of the season had laid itself over the land overnight, leaving everything silvered and precise in the morning light. They had come in from tending the cattle and Rebecca had made coffee, and they were sitting at the kitchen table with the stove going and the warmth of the room pressing around them, and he asked her something he had not asked before. "What do you want it to look like?" he said. "This place. In a year. In 5 years. What do you see when you imagine it going well?" She wrapped her hands around her coffee cup and thought about it seriously, because he had asked it seriously. "More cattle," she said. "Maybe a dozen head by next spring if I can manage it. The north pasture has been lying empty for 3 years and it is good ground. I want to put it to use. I want this to be the kind of place that does not hold its breath waiting for something to go wrong." He nodded slowly. "And you? What do you want for yourself?" She looked at him. The lamp was between them on the table and the light from it made the planes of his face look warm, and he was watching her with that quality of attention that she had spent 3 months becoming accustomed to and still was not entirely steady in the presence of. "I want to stay," she said simply. "I want to stay on this land and build something on it that my father would recognize as what he intended. I want," she paused, and then she decided to tell the truth, because she was tired of the kind of careful self-editing that came from fear. "I want not to do it alone." The silence that followed was not uncomfortable. It was the silence of two people arriving at the same place from different directions and taking a moment to recognize each other. "I have been thinking," he said, at the same careful, measured pace at which he said most things that mattered, "about whether you would consider letting me stay on properly, not as a hand working for meals, as someone with a stake in this place." He looked at her steadily. "As something more than that." She held his gaze. "What are you asking me, Cornelius?" "I am asking if you see me here," he said. "Not just on the property, I mean here." He touched the table between them gently, as though he were indicating the exact spot where the conversation had become something neither of them could pretend was just practical. "I am not a man who says things he does not mean. I have been falling in love with you since about the 3rd day I was here, and I have been trying to be patient about it because you have had enough things thrown at you without me adding to the pile. But I would rather ask and be told no than not ask and spend the rest of my life wondering." She breathed out slowly. "You are not adding to the pile," she said. "You are the only thing this year that has felt like it was being added rather than taken away." His expression changed in a way that was almost imperceptible, but that she had become good enough at reading to catch something opening, something that had been held carefully in check releasing itself. "I need to be honest with you about something," she said. "I was married for 4 years to a man who looked me in the eye and lied every time, and I did not see it until it was over. That has not made me a trusting person." "I know," he said. "I am telling you that not as a warning against you specifically. I am telling you because if you are serious, and I think you are, then you should know what you are asking for. I am not easy to reach. I have put things in places that are not quick to get to." He nodded. "I understand. I am not in a hurry. I am not going anywhere." He looked at her for a long moment. "I did not come to Harrow Creek looking for this, but I found it and I am not a fool and I know what it is worth." She reached across the table and placed her hand over his. It was the deliberate kind of touch, the kind that means something is being decided rather than merely expressed. "Then stay," she said, "and we will figure out the rest as it comes." He turned his hand over and held hers, and that was where it began, not with grand declarations or dramatic gestures, but with two careful people choosing each other across a kitchen table in the cold December of 1882, and meaning every bit of it. What followed was a season of extraordinary, quiet happiness of the kind that sneaks up on you because it arrives without fanfare and makes itself at home in ordinary moments. Cornelius was not a man who expressed love through speeches. He expressed it by being there, consistently and entirely, in a way that Rebecca had not experienced from another person since her father, and which meant something different coming from a man she had chosen herself. He expressed it by fixing the creak in the kitchen floorboard that she stepped over every morning, so that one day she stepped over it out of habit and then stopped and looked down at the floor because something was different, and realized he had seen her do it for weeks and quietly done something about it. He expressed it by learning how she took her coffee black with 1 spoon of sugar and having it ready when she came in from the morning chores without her asking. He expressed it by asking her opinion on things, genuinely, and then doing what she recommended, and by telling her when he thought she was wrong and doing it in a way that felt like respect rather than correction. She was falling in love with him in the steady, irreversible way that happens when you stop trying not to. And she expressed it too, in the meals she made with more care than she had made them in years, in the way she listened when he talked about Missouri and the drives and the country he had seen, in the way she said his name when she was addressing him, which had moved from Mr. Morgan to Cornelius, so gradually that neither of them had marked the transition, but which now sat in the air between them with a particular warmth every time she used it. Clara Dutton noticed. Clara Dutton noticed everything, which was one of the occupational characteristics of being the woman who ran the general store in a town of 300 people. "He is good for you," Clara said one afternoon in January, when Rebecca had come in for supplies and was standing at the counter while Clara made up the order. "He is a good worker," Rebecca said. Clara gave her the look of a woman who has been tolerating evasions for too long. "Rebecca and Prescott." "Clara. He looks at you like you are the first sensible thing he has found in a decade of looking." Rebecca picked up a tin of baking powder and examined it unnecessarily. "He is a good man." "He is absolutely besotted with you," Clara said cheerfully, wrapping up a block of salt. "And you are pretending you have not noticed, which is something I find both impressive and silly." Rebecca put the tin down. "I have noticed," she said quietly. Clara paused in her wrapping. And I have stopped fighting it," Rebecca said. And the small smile on her face when she said it was the kind that comes from someplace private and warm. And Clara Dutton looked at it and felt the particular satisfaction of watching a person who has been through a great deal of hardship arrive somewhere they deserve to be. Spring came to Harrow Creek the way it always did, sudden and extravagant after the brown restraint of winter, everything coming up green and gold in the south pasture, and the creek running high and fast with the rains that had come through in February. Cornelius had helped her buy 3 more cattle in January from a rancher who was downsizing, negotiating the price with a calm, matter-of-fact confidence that had brought Rebecca genuine enjoyment to witness. The herd was small but growing. The north pasture had been cleared and fenced over the winter, a project that had taken them both several weeks of hard work and produced, in addition to a useful piece of land, a habit of working beside each other that had deepened into something wordless and entirely comfortable. It was on a day in late March, when the bluebonnets were coming up along the fence line, and the air was warm enough to work in shirt sleeves, that Cornelius stopped what he was doing in the middle of fixing a gate post and looked at her across the yard with something in his expression that was different from the usual steady attention. "I have something I want to say," he said. She looked up from where she had been checking the water trough. "Then say it." He came around the fence and stood in front of her, and the sun was behind him, and the bluebonnets were doing what bluebonnets do, which is exist with an insistence that makes the world seem briefly arranged on purpose, and he took her hands in both of his and said, "I want to ask you to marry me." She had been expecting it and not expecting it simultaneously, which is a state of mind that is only possible when you love someone enough that even the things you anticipate from them still manage to surprise you. "Cornelius," she said. "I know what you are going to say about being careful," he said, and his thumbs moved gently over the backs of her hands and his gray eyes were steady on hers. "I know what trust has cost you and what carelessness looked like before I came here. I'm not asking you to pretend that none of that happened. I am asking you to look at what we have built here, you and I, these past months, and tell me if it does not look like something you want to go on building." She looked at him. She looked at the hands holding hers, the scar from the barbed wire on his left palm, the permanent weathering of the skin, the steadiness of the grip. She looked at his face, which she had read daily for months and which had never once shown her something false. She thought about the strongbox full of legal papers that he had helped her understand, the cattle that were alive and well because of his care, the fence line that stood straight because of his work, the coffee that was always ready because he knew how she took it. She thought about the morning of her father's burial and the ring beside the salt shaker and the sound of hooves leaving, and she thought about this man standing in front of her in the March sunshine with her hands in his and the bluebonnets growing along the fence, and she thought, this is what the difference looks like. This is what it is supposed to feel like. Yes, she said. The smile that broke across his face in that moment was something she knew she would carry for the rest of her life. It was not a polished thing. It was entirely unguarded and deeply felt, and it transformed his usually composed expression into something younger and more vulnerable and incandescent. And she laughed, which was not something she had planned to do, and he laughed with her, and then he pulled her gently toward him and held her the way you hold something you were not sure you would get to keep, and she pressed her face against his shoulder and let herself be held completely. They were married in June. The ceremony was at the small leaning church on the main street of Harrow Creek, and Pastor Elias Webb, who had known Rebecca since she was a girl in braids in the front pew, presided over it with a warmth that made even the most stoic members of the congregation feel the occasion in their chests. Clara Dutton cried openly and made no apology for it. Frank Dutton shook Cornelius's hand with both of his own. Reuben Ochoa brought a jar of honey from his wife's bees as a wedding gift, and presented it with a gravity that made it feel like treasure. Hank from the livery, who had been the first person to point Cornelius in the direction of the Prescott homestead, stood in the back with his hat over his heart and the expression of a man watching something work out the way it should. Rebecca wore the dress she had remade from her mother's, taken in at the waist and lengthened at the hem, and the blue of it was the color of the June sky outside the church's crooked windows. She carried wildflowers from the south pasture, tied with a strip of the same cloth she had used to wrap Cornelius's hand on the second day of his arrival, a fact she had not told him until that morning, when she had shown him the strip and explained its origin, and the look on his face when he understood had been worth more than she could say. Cornelius wore his best shirt, which Clara had helped him acquire from the dry goods section of the store 3 weeks before the wedding, and he stood at the front of the church and watched her come down the aisle and did not bother concealing anything he was feeling, which was a lot, and which was visible in the way his jaw worked once and his eyes went bright before he got himself steady. When Pastor Webb asked if anyone had objection, the congregation was quiet in the way that a room full of people who are entirely in agreement tends to be quiet, and the only sound was the wind coming through the gap at the base of the church door. They rode back to the homestead together in the long light of the June afternoon, and the land was green and full of itself, and the creek was singing over its stones in the south pasture, and the cattle were moving in the far field with their slow, weighty indifference, and the house that had been in danger of being lost was standing exactly where it had always stood, belonging to her now with a completeness it had not possessed since before her father's death. Cornelius pulled their horses to a stop at the top of the rise that looked down on the property, and they sat there for a moment taking it in. "It is a good piece of land," he said. "It is the best piece of land in the county," she said firmly, and he laughed, and she leaned sideways in her saddle until her shoulder pressed against his arm, and he shifted to meet the lean, and they sat like that for a moment with the whole evening golden landscape laid out before them, and the particular silence of two people who have arrived somewhere they mean to stay. The first year of their marriage was one of the happiest Rebecca had ever known, and she had known happy years before, so she had something to measure it against. It was not a happiness without difficulty. The work of the homestead was relentless, and the winter of 1883 was hard, with a cold snap in February that killed 2 of the cattle and strained the grain stores. But the difficulty was shared in a way that made it navigable rather than crushing. She had never understood before Cornelius what a difference that distinction made. He had taken the Prescott name with his own, at her father's memory's sake and his own choice, so that the property would carry forward what Edmund Prescott had built under the same name. He was Cornelius Morgan, but the land was registered to the Morgan Prescott operation, and Rebecca kept Prescott at the front of her own name because her father deserved to be remembered. Nobody in Harrow Creek thought this was unusual. People out here were practical about names, and they understood that the dead deserved their legacies. In the early spring of 1884, Rebecca realized she was pregnant. She told Cornelius on a Sunday morning while they were sitting at the kitchen table after breakfast, and she said it plainly, because she was a plain-speaking woman, and she watched his face go through several things in rapid succession: surprise, then something that was trying to be calm and was not quite managing it, then something that was not trying to be anything except what it was, which was joy, enormous and uncontained. He got up from his chair and came around the table and went to one knee beside her chair and took her hands in both of his and said, "Rebecca," in a voice that was not entirely steady. "I know," she said, and she was smiling so hard it was nearly painful. "You are all right," he said. "You feel well." "I feel perfectly well," she said. "I have for weeks. I wanted to be certain before I said anything." He pressed his forehead against their joined hands for a moment, and she felt the breath he let out, the long, slow one of someone releasing something they had been holding in without knowing they were holding it. Then he looked up at her. "Thank you," he said, which was perhaps not the most logical thing to say, but which she understood entirely. Their son was born in October of 1884. He was a large, loud, indignant baby who arrived on a Tuesday evening and announced himself to the household with a voice that carried clear out to the barn, where Cornelius had been sent by the midwife, a composed woman named Mrs. Hartley, who ran these proceedings with the efficiency of a military campaign and had no patience for anxious fathers underfoot. Cornelius had spent 3 hours in the barn with the horses and the lamp, not sleeping, doing things that needed doing with his hands to keep them occupied. And when Mrs. Hartley came to the barn door and told him it was done and they were both fine, he walked to the house with a pace that was very close to running. Rebecca was in the bed with the baby against her chest, and she looked up when he came in and said, "Come and see your son." And the way she said it, the son, the whole particular arrangement of those words did something to him that he could not have described in any language he possessed. They named him Edmund for her father, and his middle name was Robert for Cornelius's grandfather's brother, a man Cornelius had never met but whose story had been told to him often enough that the name felt like a thread connecting things that should be connected. Edmund Morgan Prescott grew into a boy of spectacular energy and fierce opinions, which surprised no one who knew his parents. He was walking at 10 months and had nearly made it over the paddock fence by the time he was 2, a project that his father had interrupted with exasperated affection, and his mother with an impressive calm that came from having already developed, in very short order, the particular ability mothers develop of anticipating their child's most ambitious plans and being in position before the execution begins. Life on the homestead expanded in the way that good things expand slowly, organically, with a rootedness that comes from real growth rather than sudden acquisition. By 1886, they had a herd of 20 cattle and were regularly selling to a buyer in San Antonio who had sought them out on a recommendation. Cornelius had put in a kitchen garden the previous spring, and Rebecca had expanded it the following year with a methodical pleasure that she suspected she had inherited from her father's love of order and productivity. The north pasture was in full use. The house had been extended at the back with a room that had taken Cornelius and Frank Dutton 3 months of weekends to build, and which Rebecca had claimed as a proper sitting room with a proprietariness that made Cornelius smile every time she arranged and rearranged the furniture trying to get it right. They had neighbors in a way they had not had before, not just Clara and Frank and the other townsfolk, but ranching neighbors to the north and east who had begun to stop by in the easy, routine way that indicates people have decided you are permanent. The Morgan Prescott place, as people in the county had taken to calling it, had a reputation for good cattle and fair dealing, which was the combination of reputation that mattered most in that part of Texas. In the spring of '86, a situation arose that brought some of the harder realities of the time into sharp focus. A family named the Garcias, Miguel and Alma Garcia, and their 3 children, had been working a small piece of land about 7 miles east for several years. They were Mexican, and they had dealt with the particular variety of injustice that fell on Mexican landowners and workers in Texas during that era, with the same resigned endurance that many people in their position had been forced to develop, because the alternative was a fight that the law often declined to support. When a local man named Vickers claimed a boundary dispute with the Garcia land and proceeded to move his fence line half a mile onto their property, the Garcias had little legal recourse because Vickers had the support of a county official who was not interested in examining the matter fairly. Cornelius heard about it from Ruben Ochoa, who had family connections in the Mexican community in the county and who told the story with a quiet fury that Cornelius recognized and shared. He came home and told Rebecca, and she sat with it for a moment and then said, "What can be done?" "Thomas Garland," Cornelius said, "if he would take the case." "Write to him," she said immediately, "and I will go to the Garcias tomorrow and tell them we are trying to help." She rode out the next morning, leaving Edmund with Clara Dutton, who babysat with the energy of a woman who had always wanted more children than she had been given. And she went to the Garcia property and found Alma Garcia hanging washing with the methodical determination of someone doing ordinary things as a form of resistance to the extraordinary difficulty of their situation. Rebecca introduced herself, explained what she and Cornelius intended to try, and Alma Garcia looked at her for a long moment with dark, careful eyes and then said, "Why?" "Because what is happening to you is wrong," Rebecca said. "And because I know what it is to have someone try to take your land from you and to feel like the law was arranged against you." Alma Garcia nodded slowly. "We have very little money for a lawyer. We will see what can be arranged," Rebecca said. "I cannot promise the outcome, but I can promise someone will try." Thomas Garland came out from San Antonio to examine the Garcia land records personally, at a fee that Cornelius and Rebecca paid themselves, and that they considered without sentiment the right use of money. What he found confirmed the injustice clearly. The original Garcia land title was unambiguous, and the fence Vickers had moved was on Garcia land by any legitimate measurement. Garland filed the appropriate papers and pursued the matter with the efficient tenacity that had made him good at his profession, and the county official found, when the matter came before a judge from San Antonio who had no local loyalties to protect, that his support for Vickers's claim was not legally defensible. The fence was moved back. The Garcias kept their land. It was not a complete justice. The Garcias had lost months of use of their eastern pasture, and there was no compensation for the stress and the uncertainty and the specific indignity of it, but it was something. Miguel Garcia came to the Morgan Prescott homestead the week after the judgment and brought a side of pork and a quantity of dried chili that his family had grown, and he shook Cornelius's hand with the gravity of a man who knows the difference between thanks and transaction, and Cornelius shook back with the same seriousness, and nothing more needed to be said. Rebecca had watched from the porch with Edmund on her hip, and she had thought about timing, about the way things happened in proximity to each other, and what the proximity meant. She had thought about this before, in reference to her own life, and she would think about it again in the years to come, But that afternoon she simply held her son and watched her husband stand in the yard with a man whose land had just been returned to him. And she felt that the world, while not fixed, was at least in places being pushed in the right direction by people who had decided to push. In the fall of 1886, she wrote her brother. This requires explanation, because she had said she had no brothers or sisters, and in the literal sense she did not. She had a half-brother, her father's son by a woman he had known before Rebecca's mother, a young man named Thomas Prescott who had grown up in Austin with his mother, and whom Rebecca had met only twice, the last time being when Edmund Sr. had died and Thomas had written a brief letter of condolence. They were not close, but they were connected, and he had expressed in his letter a wish to visit the homestead someday. She had put off the invitation because of the immediate crises of that year. Now, with the property stable and the life she and Cornelius had built together taking on a settled, confident shape, she found herself wanting the family she had always had, only in the fragmented, partial sense, to feel a little less fragmented. Thomas Prescott arrived in November and stayed for 3 weeks, and he was a lanky, bookish young man of 24 with their father's eyes and his mother's nervous energy, and Edmund took to him with the immediate affectionate tyranny that 2-year-olds reserve for people who do not yet know their tricks. Thomas was delighted by this. He was the kind of person who had spent his life in a city, and found the physical rawness of the homestead both alarming and fascinating in equal measure. And Cornelius, who had a gift for meeting people where they were rather than where he expected them to be, put him to work in ways that were useful without being humiliating. And Thomas went home to Austin 3 weeks later with blisters on his hands and a look in his eyes that said something in him had rearranged. He wrote afterward that he had never in his life seen 2 people who were as clearly made for each other as Rebecca and Cornelius, and that being in their house felt like being inside something that was working exactly as it was supposed to work, and that this was rarer than anyone admitted. Rebecca read the letter to Cornelius in the evening, and he listened with his head tilted slightly, the way he did when something landed true, and then he said, "He is a perceptive young man," and she said, "He has good eyes," and they said no more about it, but the letter stayed on the mantel for a month before she put it in the strongbox with the other things she kept. In the spring of 1888, their second child was born. It was a girl this time, announced into the world with a voice as emphatic as her brother's had been, and Rebecca looked at her in the lamplight of the bedroom and felt the particular, overwhelming love of a parent for a specific child, not general love, but the love for this face, this person, this particular small creature who had not existed yesterday and was now entirely central to everything. They named her Frances, for Cornelius's mother. He had not suggested it, Rebecca had, on the strength of everything she knew about the woman who had raised a good man on very little and then left too soon. And Cornelius had been quiet for a long moment when she proposed it, and then said yes in a voice that needed a moment to recover itself before continuing. Edmund, at 3½, received his sister with the complex mixture of fascination and territorial suspicion that is universal to eldest children. Within a month he had transitioned to possessive devotion, which was worse for Rebecca's nerves but better for the overall domestic situation. And by the time Frances was 6 months old and had developed the ability to laugh at him, which she did frequently and with evident delight, the matter of their relationship was settled. The years went forward with the particular beauty of years that are full rather than eventful, which is a distinction that matters more than people acknowledge. Full years are the ones where every season brings something and nothing is wasted, where the work and the love and the ordinary days accumulate into a life that, when you look back at it from any distance, seems to have been precisely what it should have been. Cornelius built up the Morgan Prescott herd with a patience and expertise that began to attract genuine attention in the county. He was a natural stockman. He had always known that, had been doing it for other men's herds for a decade, and doing it for his own operation brought out a quality of care and precision that made the cattle better and the land better, and the whole enterprise more productive. By 1890, they were running 40 head, which was a significant herd for a property of their size, and they had developed a reputation for stock that was worth paying for. Rebecca managed the books with the same precision she had applied to the bank negotiation in that first terrible month, and she was good at it, better perhaps than she had known before necessity made it her job. She kept records that would have made any accountant respectful, detailed, organized, cross-referenced in a way that made patterns visible and problems detectable early. It was she who noticed, in the summer of '90, that a neighboring ranch was in financial difficulty and would likely have to sell cattle at below-market prices, and it was she who suggested they approach carefully and offer a fair price rather than taking advantage, which was both the ethical choice and, as it turned out, the practical one, because the family remembered the fairness long after the transaction and sent 3 other buyers their way over the following years. Thomas Prescott came back the following summer and the summer after that, and by the 3rd visit, he was staying long enough to be genuinely useful rather than charmingly in the way, and Rebecca began to suspect that the appeal of the homestead had as much to do with the Morgan Prescott way of life as with any obligation of family feeling. He was figuring out what kind of person he was, in the way that young men often do when they are given enough room and enough honest example to figure it from. Edmund, at 6, had become the kind of child who takes everything seriously and nothing personally, which was so entirely his father's manner of moving through the world that Rebecca sometimes watched him with a mixture of amusement and amazement. He was already helping with the cattle in small ways, which Cornelius permitted with a carefulness and patience that Rebecca observed from a distance and loved him for. Frances was 4 and entirely ungovernable in the most delightful sense. She had her mother's directness and her father's quiet ferocity and a laugh that seemed designed specifically to make everyone around her feel better than they had a moment before. In the evenings, when the children were in bed and the house had settled into its nighttime self, Rebecca and Cornelius had developed a habit of sitting on the porch in the summer or at the kitchen table in the winter, and talking the way long-married people talk when they have nothing to prove and nowhere else to be, in fragments and threads, picking up conversations from days ago, sharing the small observations of the day. He still had the quality of listening that had struck her in those early weeks, and she still had the directness that he had recognized before she was aware he was recognizing it. And these things together made for conversations that covered everything from the practical to the philosophical without any particular distinction between the two. One evening in the fall of 1891, they were sitting on the porch in the last warmth before the cold came in for good, and the land was the particular deep amber of October in South Texas, and Edmund was chasing something in the south pasture that was probably a rabbit and definitely too fast for him. And Frances had fallen asleep against Cornelius's shoulder with the absolute, trusting abandon of small children who know they are safe, and Rebecca was watching the light move across the pasture. And she said, without planning to, "I think about that week sometimes, the week you came." He looked at her, Frances' breath steadily against his shoulder. "Think about what that week was," she continued. "Everything that left all at once, and then you came and nothing left after that. Things only kept coming in." He was quiet for a moment. "I was not planning to stay," he said. "I want you to know that. When I rode into Harrow Creek, I had no plan beyond the next stretch of road. I did not come looking for this." "I know," she said. "That is one of the things about it that I find most remarkable, that neither of us was looking. And yet—" "And yet," he agreed. She looked at him sideways. "Do you believe in that? In things happening at the right time for a reason?" He thought about it seriously, the way he always thought about serious things. "I believe that some things that happen look like accident until you look at them long enough," he said, "and then they look like something else." "Like what?" "Like sense," he said simply. "Like the kind of sense that is not obvious until it is the only kind of things make." She nodded slowly. She said later that the timing was not an accident, she said. He looked at her. Who? Me, she said. I will say that later, when people ask how we came to be. She held his gaze with the particular steadiness that she kept specifically for the things that mattered most. I will tell them that you rode into my life the same week everything else rode out, and that I know the timing was not an accident. The look on his face in that moment was everything she had ever wanted to see on the face of someone who loved her. He shifted carefully, so as not to wake Frances, and he put his free arm around Rebecca, and she leaned into him, and they sat together on the porch of the house that had almost been lost, and was now entirely and completely theirs, while the amber light moved slowly across the south pasture, and Edmund chased his rabbit, and the October evening came in mild and sweet around them. The years after that were the years of building, not in the dramatic sense, but in the deep, steady sense of people who are adding layer upon layer to something that is already sound, and are doing it because they love the work and believe in what they are making. In 1893, they added a proper bunkhouse beside the barn, because the herd had grown large enough that they needed seasonal help during branding and roundup, and Cornelius had particular ideas about how working hands should be housed that had more to do with his own years of working for other men than any standard of the time. The bunkhouse was modest but solid, with a proper stove and real bunks, and the men who worked the Morgan Prescott place for roundup talked about it in the way that traveling workers talk about a good employer, with the specific appreciation of people who are used to being treated as tools and have encountered something different. Thomas Prescott made a final kind of visit in '93, this one with a purpose he had been gathering his courage to announce. He wanted to buy a small piece of property in the county and try his hand at something practical. He had spent his Austin years in a law office doing clerical work that bored him comprehensively, and the 3 visits to the homestead had accumulated into a conviction that he wanted to work with his hands on land that was his own. Rebecca sat with this information for an evening and then told him the following morning that the piece of land directly east of the Morgan Prescott North pasture had been listed for sale by a family moving to California, and that if he was serious, she would help him negotiate for it, and that having family close by was something she had wanted for longer than she had admitted to anyone. He was serious. She helped him negotiate. He bought the land. Thomas Prescott turned out to be a better farmer than anyone had predicted, including himself, and his property prospered in a modest, determined way that was entirely in keeping with his character. He and Cornelius developed the comfortable, undemonstrative friendship of men who respect each other's competence and have no need to make a ceremony of it. Edmund, who adored his young uncle and followed him around with the same devoted intensity that he directed at his father, grew up with a broader idea of the world than he might have had otherwise, which Rebecca counted as one of the better unintended consequences of the whole arrangement. The winter of 1894 was the hardest they had faced since their first year of marriage. A drought had strained the summer grazing, and the cold that followed was severe, and they lost 8 cattle over 3 weeks to a combination of cold and weakened condition that Cornelius worked to prevent and manage with an exhausting, around-the-clock dedication that he drove himself through on 4 hours of sleep and complete conviction that the herd could be salvaged. Rebecca worked alongside him through the worst of it, and the rest of the herd survived, and in the spring they rebuilt what they had lost with the deliberate, undramatic patience of people who have been through enough to know that the next season is always coming. What struck her most, looking back on that winter, was not the hardship was part of the life, and she had made her peace with that, but the way they had moved through it together. There had been no blame, no recrimination, no separate withdrawing into individual anxiety. They had worked the problem together with the coherence of a single mind in 2 bodies, and when the crisis passed and the spring came and the herd was growing again, they had sat in the kitchen on the first warm morning of March and looked at each other across the table with the particular expression of two people who have just confirmed something they already believed and are glad of the confirmation. By 1895, Edmund was 11 and Frances was 7, and the homestead had taken on the full, settled character of a place that has been loved into being over many years. The kitchen garden was extensive and productive. The herd was at 45 head. The house had the specific patina of a home that is used and repaired and added to over time, which is the best kind of house there is. Cornelius had gray beginning at his temples by then, which Rebecca found distinguished in a way she told him about with a directness that made him laugh. She had lines at the corners of her own eyes that were, she maintained, entirely the fault of squinting against 15 years of Texas sun, and he maintained equally that they were the most beautiful lines he had ever seen, and that she had a way of looking at him when he said that which combined gratitude and exasperation in a ratio that was entirely her own. In the summer of '95, they received news that Elias Crane, the trail boss who had written Cornelius's reference letter in those first weeks at the homestead, had retired from driving cattle and was living in Abilene with his sister. Cornelius wrote to him, a long letter that was his equivalent of a novel, and Crane wrote back with a warmth that established a correspondence that would continue for several years. Two men who had crossed a large amount of hard country together in a practical capacity, and come out the other side with a mutual respect that had mellowed into genuine friendship over the distance. Rebecca read Crane's letters when Cornelius passed them over after his first reading, which he always did, and she found in them a portrait of Cornelius as other people saw him: capable, reliable, the kind of man you wanted on the other side of a difficult thing that matched and deepened her own. In the fall of 1896, Rebecca discovered she was pregnant for the third time. She was 38 years old, which was not unusual for the time, and she told Cornelius with the same directness she had told him about Edmund, though there was less of the held breath in it this time, and more of the immediate warmth of people who know what they are welcoming. Their second son was born in April of 1897. They named him James, for no particular historical reason except that both of them had always liked the name, and it suited him, which was evident from almost the first week. James Morgan Prescott was a quieter baby than either of his siblings had been, with large dark eyes that watched everything with an attention that was disconcertingly intelligent for someone who could not yet sit up, and a temperament of such general equanimity that Rebecca sometimes checked on him simply because the silence was unprecedented. Edmund, at 12, received this development with the magnanimity of someone who has already worked out his position in the family and is secure enough in it to welcome an addition. Frances, at 9, appointed herself the authority on infant management with a confidence that left no room for dispute, and was, remarkably, quite good at it. The family at the Morgan Prescott homestead, in the last years of the 19th century, was the kind of family that happens when two people choose each other carefully and build something together for years with the same quality of attention they brought to the choosing. It was not a perfect life, no life was, and anyone who claimed otherwise was either lying or not paying attention, but it was a good life, a full life, a life in which every part of it had been earned and understood and appreciated in the earning. The century turned without great ceremony in Harrow Creek. There was a gathering at the Ironwood on the last night of 1899 that was less about drinking than about marking, and the people of the town stood in the street at midnight in the cold December air and watched the year turn over with the specific feeling of people who have survived more than they expected to and are willing to try the next 100 years. Cornelius and Rebecca stood together in that street with Edmund at 15 on one side and Frances at 11 on the other, and James at 2.5 on Cornelius's hip, awake much later than he should have been and absolutely unconcerned about it, watching everything with those dark, attentive eyes. Clara Dutton was nearby, white-haired now and slower on her feet than she had been, but present and characteristically warm. Frank had died the previous spring, and Clara was managing the general store with the help of her eldest daughter, and she had the particular quality of someone who is grieving and going forward simultaneously, which Rebecca understood. At midnight, when the town gave a ragged cheer, and someone fired a gun into the air that made James grab at Cornelius's collar and bury his face against his neck, Rebecca reached across and found Cornelius's free hand in the dark and held it, and he pressed her fingers and she pressed back, and that was their centuries turning. In the spring of 1900, the Harrow Creek area experienced a wave of small improvements that characterized the gradual modernization of rural Texas. A new telegraph line, a better road connection to the San Antonio Post route, and a railroad spur that was discussed but not built for another 5 years. These things changed the character of the county slowly, the way all the changes had come, not overnight, but accumulating. Cornelius watched these changes with the equanimity of a man who has seen enough country to know that change is the consistent thing. Rebecca watched them with the analytical interest of someone who is always calculating what they mean for the practical enterprise of running a property. They adapted, as they had always adapted together, practically, without wasting energy on nostalgia for the way things had been. Edmund at 16 had become a young man of quiet intensity, who was already Cornelius's equal on a horse and his near equal with cattle, and who had announced with the characteristic directness of both his parents that he intended to study law in San Antonio after his schooling was finished, which was something nobody argued with because the logic of it was entirely visible in who he was. Thomas Prescott, whose adjacent property had grown considerably, had encouraged this trajectory with the particular investment of someone who watched a boy grow up and feels personally responsible for the best of him. Frances at 14 had her mother's dark hair and her father's gray eyes, and a wit that could take a room apart and reassemble it with everyone laughing before they quite understood what had happened. She was being formally schooled now by the teacher at the Harrow Creek schoolhouse, a young woman named Miss Abernethy who came from a college in the East, and who had the intelligence to recognize, within her first week of knowing Francis Morgan Prescott, that she was dealing with a student who would go further than Harrow Creek by any route that was made available to her. James, at 3, remained the most equable person in the house, which was an achievement given the surrounding competition, and he followed his older siblings through their days with a trusting persistence that they bore with more patience than Rebecca would have expected, which told her that they had absorbed something worth absorbing about how to treat people who are smaller than you. One afternoon in the summer of 1901, Rebecca was sitting in the sitting room with the door open to the evening air, writing a letter to Thomas Garland, who had retired from his practice, but maintained the correspondence they had begun all those years ago when he confirmed the water rights argument. And she heard Cornelius come in from the day's work, and heard him stop in the hallway the way he sometimes stopped, as though he was taking something in. He came to the sitting room door and leaned against the frame and looked at her, and she looked up from her letter, and he said, "Do you remember the morning I came up this path with my hat in my hands?" She looked at him. He had more gray now, and the years had deepened the weather in his face, but his eyes were the same steady gray they had always been, and the way he looked at her had not changed in quality since the first week, only deepened. "I remember exactly," she said. "You were wearing those boots and that expression." "What expression?" "The expression of a man who has been in the world a long time and is hoping this particular doorstep is better than the last one." He smiled. "Was it?" She put her letter down. "You know it was." He came into the room and sat down in the chair across from her, the one he always sat in, and he looked at her with something that was both ordinary and enormous, the kind of look that a marriage accumulates through all the days of its making. "I want you to know," he said, "that everything I have wanted to be in this life I have got to be here, on this land with you, "Whatever happens from here, nothing is happening," she said, reading his expression. "You are all right." "I know I am," he said. "I am not being morbid. I am being grateful. There is a difference." He leaned forward with his elbows on his knees. "I am trying to tell you that I am the luckiest man I have ever personally known, and I know that this is not something men are supposed to say." "You have never been particularly concerned with what men are supposed to say," she pointed out. "No," he agreed. "I have not." He paused. "I love you, Rebecca. Not in the sense of a statement that needs to be made, I know you know it. In the sense of wanting to sit in this room and say it plainly in the middle of an ordinary Tuesday." She looked at him across the room for a moment. 19 years since he had come up the path with his hat in his hands. 19 years since she had stood on the porch of this house and assessed him with careful eyes and said send him over and then shown him where things were. 19 years of shared work and shared seasons and shared difficulty and shared joy, and 3 children who were living proof of all of it, and a piece of land that was still standing, still producing, still entirely theirs. "I love you," she said, "in the same sense." He smiled, and it was still, after 19 years, the fully unguarded kind, the one that started in his eyes and moved slow across the rest of his face, and she thought that there was nothing in the world that looked better to her than that. The last evening of that particular summer, they sat together on the porch in the blue dark, the same porch they had sat on so many times before, and the coyotes were calling as they always called, and the land was the same land it had always been, which was the best thing about it. The children were in the house behind them, Edmund at his studies, Frances writing something in the small notebook she kept private, James asleep with the untroubled certainty of a child who has never had reason to doubt that the world is well arranged. The creek was running in the south pasture. The cattle were settled. The house was whole. Rebecca leaned her head against Cornelius's shoulder, and he put his arm around her. And they sat in the particular peace of 2 people who have built something worth sitting still inside of. And the night came in around them mild and dark and full of stars, the way the Texas sky is in August, so impossibly full that it looks like someone has been extravagant with it on purpose. She said later, she always said later, because the saying of it was part of how she understood it, that he had ridden into her life the same week everything else rode out, and that she had known, even in those first terrible days when knowing it was not something she could afford to act on, that the timing was not an accident. She said that some things that look like coincidence are actually the precise, deliberate arrangement of a life finding its shape. She said that you could spend your whole time in the world looking for the thing that would make the difference, and then one afternoon on a porch in South Texas, the difference could come up the path with its hat in its hands and ask if you needed help, and you could say yes, and it would change everything, and you would understand much later that none of it had been random at all. Cornelius, when she said this, always said, "I found you in a bad week and you kept me for every good one after." And she always said, "That is about right." And it was. It was exactly, precisely, completely right. The Morgan Prescott homestead stood on its creek-watered South Texas land for many years after that summer evening, and the people who came and went on it and grew up on it and worked it and loved it would look back on the 2 people who had chosen each other against the background of loss and difficulty, and a West that was as harsh as it was beautiful. And they would say that what those 2 had built was exactly what it looked like, something real, something earned, something that had stood every storm the country could send and come out the other side not just intact, but fuller than it had begun. The land remembered them. The land always does, when people love it properly and work it honestly and refuse to let it go in the bad weeks, the way Rebecca Prescott had refused in that first terrible month, the way she went on refusing every time the easy thing would have been to stop holding on. She had held on, and into the holding, the best thing in her life had ridden, unhurried and unplanned, on a smoke-gray mare with a cracked saddle and $3 and no intention of staying. The intention had not survived the first week. Nothing important ever does, when the thing waiting on the other side of it is real.